Good evening, morning, afternoon, or whatever time it may be for you. You are about to listen to a Royal Mirror audio story. The audio will be accompanied with visuals to enhance the experience. However, if you prefer to simply listen, they aren't necessary. If you'd like to follow along, or would simply prefer to read the story, you can find a link to the text in the description below. I hope you enjoy. Now, on to our tale. Godspeed, the Duke of Boots, Part 2. Duke was awoken by the first traces of natural light slipping through the dusty blinds of his home. He shifted carefully and slowly, doing what he could to avoid disturbing his sleeping wife beside him. A slight sigh escaped her as Duke's weight left the mattress, but her breathing stayed level, and she remained resting. The edges of Duke's mouth turned up into a smile as he took just a moment to watch over his sleeping spouse before he slipped out of the room. As the patriarch of the Sandhill family, Duke was responsible for not only his immediate relatives, but the entire town that supported Boots gas station and shared its name. He, his wife, and a few close friends had established the municipality, if it could be called that, when the shipments for the gas station stopped coming in. They needed people to keep Boots supplied, and the people who came needed someone to look after them. So, Duke stepped up, and when his time had passed, he hoped one of his sons would step up too. For now, he had work to do. It took him a few moments to pull on his work clothes and boots, put his knapsack on his back and his rifle over his shoulder, and slip out the front door into the early morning Texas sun. As his eyes adjusted, Duke began to see the outline of the pickup truck waiting for him, just as it did every morning. He blinked a few times as his vision cleared, and he saw his son, Jack Sandhill, standing in front of the truck with arms crossed, looking combative as he often did these days. The boy was 22, so maybe it was just a late onset adolescent rebellion kicking in. Duke stepped down off the porch, and Jack called out to him. "You know, I could have shot those fuckers last night, Pa," Jack said insistently, his eyes following Duke as the elder man made his way around to the truck bed. Duke paused and looked over at Jack, giving his son a loving smile. "Well, good morning to you too, Jack," Duke said, with an easygoing warmth and just a hint of sarcasm. "And mind your language," he concluded as he started to walk towards the truck bed again, glancing inside at the solar panel repair parts they were going to deliver before dropping off his ruck and rifle into the bed. I'm serious, Pa. I saw 'em perfectly from the roof, and they didn't even know I was there. 2 quick pulls of a finger and they wouldn't have been bothering us anymore." There was an urgency in his voice. It was clear to Duke that Jack was itching to prove himself. Duke hoped he'd get that chance, just not with a rifle. The older man put his hands on his hips, pushing back his jacket slightly. "Look, son, a fight's an awful lot like an oil leak," Duke began to explain to Jack. "You'd be awfully stupid not to be prepared to deal with one, and you'd be even stupider to go seeking one out." Duke shrugged his shoulders and looked directly at Jack. Besides, son, it's just not our way." Jack raised an eyebrow at his father. "Oh yeah? Ambrose says you used to shoot lots of people, Pa." Jack jerked his thumb back towards the cab of the truck, where a man about Duke's age sat behind the wheel. Ambrose had been Duke's friend since boyhood. They were brothers in everything but name, which mostly meant that Ambrose spent a lot of time being a pain in Duke's ass. "Yeah, well, Ambrose says a lot of things," Duke retorted, looking over Jack's shoulder at the cab and rolling his eyes. I bet he gave you that old yarn about us winning a fight against 10 other men that time in Nevada." Jack shrugged, then gave a sheepish nod. Duke looked away with a smug look of satisfaction, as if Jack was confirming something obvious. "Well, as you might imagine, that one's completely hogwash," Duke told his son. "It was more like 20 men. Now, get in the back." Duke concluded with a little chuckle, and he lifted his chin towards the truck bed. Jack couldn't resist a smile, shaking his head as he walked to the back of the truck and climbed into the bed. Duke reached for the passenger's side door and pulled it open, stepping up into the cab and taking a seat beside the taciturn driver. Duke settled in and shut the door, leaving the cab in silence, other than the sounds of Duke doing up his seatbelt. It was the type of silence that could only be comfortable to longtime friends, and it suited Duke just fine. Finally, he turned and looked directly at the driver. "Ambrose," he started slowly, rolling his tongue before beginning his next statement. "You telling tall tales about me to my boy again?" Duke asked. The driver let out a sigh, reaching for the key and turning it, feeling the truck rumble to life underneath them. Once the truck had started, he answered. "Did I ever stop?" Ambrose asked Duke, a wry smile starting to spread across his face. The pair gradually broke into laughter as Ambrose pulled the truck away from Duke's home. This was how most of Duke's days started, driving out with Jack and Ambrose to do their daily rounds to the farms and the workshops that kept Boots up and running. "How's Jimmy's peanut farm doing, Ambrose?" Duke asked as they drove down the long dirt path from Duke's house to the highway. "Those things are always in high demand. And no, not just because I snack on them all day long." The driver allowed himself a snort and tilted his head slightly towards Duke to respond. "Here he's got a record-setting harvest, Duke," Ambrose said slowly. "Might have to put you on a diet." It was Duke's turn to snort and shake his head amicably. The two men smiled and let that familiar, comfortable silence set in. As they turned off the dirt road and onto the highway, the sounds of the vehicle moving beneath them evened out as well as they made their way to their daily labors. As the midday sun waxed over the workshop servicing the solar farm that powered Boots and the surrounding homes, Isidore Sandhill pushed his glasses up on his face as he pored over his latest contraption. He tended to focus more on making productive devices for his family, but today he was focused on destruction. Isidore might have been more bookish and reserved than either his father Duke or his older brother Jack, but he had to admit that he shared the Sandhill family's fascination with weapons of war. When he had found the schematics for the device in an old U.S. Army field manual, he knew Boots needed one, or perhaps more like a dozen of them, defending the gas station. Duke had initially balked at the number of ball bearings it would cost him, but Isidore had won him over. They were almost ready to be planted around Boots. They just needed a remote detonator. "Isidore!" came the call of his brother, Jack, from behind him. The younger of the two brothers held up a finger for one moment as he pondered over the detonation mechanism for a few seconds more, before spinning around in his office chair and seeing his brother strolling into the workshop, closely followed by Duke and lastly Ambrose. "Did you bring the parts for my solar panels?" Isidore asked them as they entered the room. Duke rolled his eyes and put his hands on his hips, glancing between Jack and Isidore. Everyone says you two boys are nothing alike, but you've got your lack of manners in common. He smirked and gave a shrug. I guess you come by it honestly, though. Isidore looked down and blushed slightly, but the smile didn't leave his face. Sorry, Dad. How was your day? Isidore asked, recovering from his embarrassment and lifting his eyes to meet his father's gaze. It wasn't much, but Duke had to give the boy points for trying. It's been going well. We stopped by over at Jimmy's. The farm's looking mighty fine. Duke let one hand off of his hip to jerk a thumb back at their driver. Finally, something that Ambrose doesn't exaggerate about. The other man's face portrayed no change in emotion, but deep down, he always felt a slight tinge of pride that Duke knew him so well. Duke continued. And yes, son, we did get your parts. They're out in the truck. Duke explained, approaching Isidore, stepping over loose wires, screws, and other electrical and mechanical detritus that littered the cool cement floor. And what about you, Isidore? Do you have something for me? The more technically apt of the brothers picked up the device he had been working on and held it up for his father. Check it out, he said proudly. It was a rounded rectangle with the words, "Front towards enemy," crudely stenciled on one face of it. The words aren't strictly necessary, but they're kind of a vibe, so I had to copy them, Isidore explained. Duke reached out and took the explosive from his son. So, this is supposed to be some sort of landmine? He asked Isidore, raising his brow. You know, son, we can't go around making the road dangerous for normal folks. Duke began to explain, but his son waved his hand and shook his head dismissively. No, it won't be a danger to regular people. It has to be intentionally remote detonated. Isidore began to explain. It can deal damage over a wide area, so what I'm thinking is we put these out at preset distances in front of the gas station, and if any of those truck freaks get closer than we're comfortable with... Isidore made an explosion sound and mimed an explosion with his hands. A twinkle of additional excitement appeared in his eyes. Then, if they keep coming, we can detonate the next set, and then the next set until they stop coming. Duke nodded along in understanding and stroked his chin. All right then. When can you have it ready? Isidore became sheepish at that question, rolling his shoulders and twiddling his thumbs slightly. Well, the mines I can have placed in their kill zones marked by the time you start your shift at the station tonight. He reached one hand behind his head and gave a nervous scratch. But, I don't really have any way to remote detonate them, and I don't really have any timeline on getting one. Duke raised an eyebrow and remembered his previous day's shift. He reached into his pocket and felt the refugee's smartphone still there. Gently, he withdrew it from his pocket and offered it to Isidore. I think I have your new remote detonator right here. What do you think, Isidore? Can you make it work? The boy's eyes flitted over the device presented to him, and, like every good toy his father had gotten him over the years, he was delighted by it, even in the waning twilight of his childhood. He snatched the thing out of Duke's hand. Sure can, he said excitedly, bringing it over to his desk and plopping it down, starting work on it immediately. He fiddled for a few moments, forgetting the others were there, before briefly snapping himself out of his work. Oh, you guys can just leave the solar panel parts by the door to the workshop? He said, before focusing right back in on the smartphone. Duke gave Isidore an unacknowledged nod and began to leave. Jack, however, couldn't leave without one last little exchange with his little brother. Isidore, you should come out with us sometime. Learn the ropes. Work a little with some of God's creations instead of your own. The younger brother slowly turned his attention away from his work and to the others one more time. You know, I don't see much of a functional difference between what I do here and what the rest of the community does. Plants take energy from the sun and convert it into a form we humans need to survive. My solar panels do basically the same thing, just the form's a little different. He paused for a moment to push his glasses up on his face before adding, Besides, Jack, you're the heir to the Sandhill dynasty, not me. You're the one who needs to know how Dad operates. I'm happy here in my little workshop. Jack gave a shrug and started to leave with the others, pausing at the door of the workshop and putting his hands on the frame. He turned back and looked over his shoulder. You never know what you might need to know, little bro, he concluded before slipping out of the workshop. Isidore heard the truck rumble to life outside and drive away from the solar farm, the rumble of the engine disappearing off into the distance. Finally, he was left with nothing but the silence and the machines that he so loved. Duke's evening shift at Boots had been mostly uneventful. Other than the complete nuclear family, he had the opportunity to help when he found them standing in front of the till that evening. It was pretty rare that he got travelers at all, let alone a husband and wife with daughter and son in tow. He reckoned the lad was about 12, and the daughter may have been about 8. They had been just as awestruck about the functional rest stop as the refugee, and, as Duke had filled their sacks with supplies, the father had tried to force his gold watch on the gas station proprietor. Duke had managed to convince him out of it, but had been forced to take the gold chain it hung on, which the father insisted held no sentimental value. These people must have been well-to-do back in the APG's territory. They'd be a nice, juicy target for the road gang. Duke gave them some advice about the gangs and how to avoid them, and then they were on their way. It was people like them who gave Duke hope. If they could make the trek out of a land where they clearly enjoyed riches to try and find their family some freedom, he could do the same for his boys. Isidore was tagging along with him, since he'd just finished installing his mines. He was leaning back against the wall behind the till, with a bored expression on his face. It was clear he didn't appreciate the significance of his father's exchange with that family, but Duke hoped he would in time. 10, maybe 20 minutes passed when Duke saw those telltale high beams shining into his window, as he so often did since the road gang started harassing these parts. He really hoped that the traveling family had taken his advice to heart. The walkie-talkie sitting on top of the counter crackled to life.
Till, this is Overwatch. I count about a dozen Vics rolling down the road from the east.
Duke heard the garbled voice of his son Jack coming in from the roof, and picked up the walkie to respond. Hear you loud and clear, Jack. We see him, he responded. He looked over to Isidore, whose bored face had taken on a nervous pallor. What do you think, son? Are you ready on that detonator? Isidore struggled to find words to respond, but was choked back by fear. He managed a simple nod instead. We are ready to activate those mines as needed down here. Ambrose, how's the posse doing? Duke asked. There was another crackle before the response came in.
I got 6 very polite, yet very well-armed gentlemen in the back of my truck, looking to get into a disagreement.
Ambrose said. with a brief pause before completing.
Jim says you need to lay off on the nuts if you want him to come, though.
Duke looked over at Isidore and gave him a reassuring wink, smiling at the joke. Yeah, well, get him down here. We'll negotiate Boots' peanuts expenditures after whatever goes down, goes down. Duke held the walkie for a few brief moments before the final response came in.
10-4.
Was Ambrose's simple response. Duke gave a nod and passed the walkie to Isidore, taking another walkie off the counter and switching it on before clipping it to one of his front coat pockets. He grabbed his lever action from underneath the front counter and stepped out towards the door as he always did. Reaching up towards the coat rack beside the door, Duke retrieved his hat and slipped it on, turning back towards Isidore to give one last instruction before leaving. Any of those punks shoot me. You detonate whatever the hell Jack tells you. Got that, Isidore? He told his son, pointing towards the walkie in his hand. For a few painful moments, it felt like all Duke's young son would be able to get out was another nod. But he managed a few words. Yes, sir, Isidore said. A smile appeared on Duke's face, and he gave Isidore an approving nod before pushing the door open and stepping out into the cool night air. Duke slowly and deliberately walked out towards the center of the highway, noticing that the road gang was starting to form a ring of vehicles not quite a mile off, each of their high beams shining down directly towards him and his gas station. He figured it was some sort of intimidation tactic. He also figured standing down a dozen armed vehicles alone was an intimidation tactic of its own. Or at least he hoped it was. He reached down and grabbed the walkie on his coat pocket, pressing the transmit button. Everybody ready? A flurry of affirmative responses came from the men connected to his comms. The cowboy cracked his neck back and forth, taking a few moments before pressing the button again. All right, let's get this thing done. This concludes our Royal Mirror audio story for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If there's an additional part to the story, it should appear in the description below when it is available. I'd like to take this time to thank all of the creators of the open source content used in this video, the ultimate creator, without whom any further creation would be impossible, and of course you, the viewer, for listening to it. Until we meet again, goodbye.